So I want to talk about Kevin Nolan and David Moyes' futures at the club, respectively, because very recently I was on the American Hammers TV. Go check it out if you haven't already. And it was on Monday night or Tuesday, super early in the morning, on an episode that was hosted by Hammers Chat Patreon Ray Borum, the big boy himself. The topic of Moyes' future came up, and whether or not he should stay, whether or not we should keep him, whether or not he's the right man, all of these things. We had a nice, lovely conversation about it, so do go check it out. But it's been playing on my mind since. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I sort of wanted to talk about Nolan specifically because his role at the club is super interesting to me. Because not only do I think it's very, very important for our survival and also for Moyes' survival at the club in that sense, if certain things were to happen to Moyes, his role could get even bigger, and that might be what he's thinking about. So I'm not trying to ape on old topics with Moyes that maybe perhaps certain controversial videos on this channel have done. Nice to see you on the boats, Jazz, as always. I gave him a nice big hug. But let's talk about it a bit, right? So, to my knowledge, Kevin Nolan has been here for 3 games, and I say to my knowledge because I can't exactly remember when he came in, but I believe, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below, of course, City, Liverpool, Southampton are his games. What has been his influence on the team? Well, it's obviously quite difficult to tell. I mean, it's a very, very short reign for a start. You can't really be drawing conclusions instantly from stuff like that. And then, of course, there's City, which is a complete and utter trash fire. But Liverpool and Southampton were interesting to me because the players put in performances that reminded me of that passion, that grit, that fight determination that Kevin Nolan had as a player, and Kevin Nolan would always distill on teams he was captain of. Because of course we can attribute that to Sam Allardyce, and that's totally a fair thing to do. I'm not saying Kevin Nolan was the reason Sam Allardyce was ever any successful in any role, but he shouldn't be overlooked at all, right? And then there's also the fact that now I think he made these runs at Hull as well, but Bowen's runs really, really, really remind me of some of Kevin Nolan's runs. Like, I loved watching Kevin Nolan as a footballer because he had the innate ability to be in the right place at the right time every single time. Like, how many of his goals were tap-ins? Go back and check, go back and watch. There were a lot of tap-ins, and it wasn't a tap-in through chance. It was a tap-in because he knew where the ball was going to be. He could anticipate it. My top lip is really itchy for some reason. I apologise. And Bowen has this ability to make these perfectly timed runs through the centre that Nolan would make off of, say, Andy Carroll, or when we're in the Championship off of Carlton Cole and people like that. These perfectly timed runs bent straight through the centre that defenders really struggle to pick up on, and that was something Kevin Nolan did as well. Kevin Nolan had that innate ability to know where to move. Now, again, I'm not attributing that purely to Kevin Nolan, but it wouldn't surprise me if Bowen looked up to someone like Kevin Nolan now he's at the club, and they had sit-down conversations, and perhaps that's also why Bowen puts in performances as good as he does and why he tries as much as he does, because Bowen came in to replace Snodgrass, and actually he's putting in as much effort as Snodgrass was. I think I don't look at that change in the team and think we're lacking any effort or any drive because of it, which is the main thing Snodgrass brings. That's not even a diss to Snodgrass or to Bowen. That's like a huge praise to Bowen to say actually you're matching those levels, because Snodgrass's levels of work rate are just ridiculously high, right? But what's interesting to me is if Nolan wasn't there, would it be more difficult to motivate the players? Because to be honest with you, I think Moyes, I mean, he doesn't motivate me personally as a fan, but when I see him talk, he's the most dour human being in the world, man. It's so depressing to listen to sometimes. I mean, I bring this up quite often, so I apologise if you've heard me say it or anyone else. But I remember the first interview after his first match as Sunderland manager in the Premier League. I think it was on Match of the Day, and he was already talking about a relegation fight. He was like, "Yeah, it's going to be a tough season. We're going to have to try. Just like it's going to be tough for us to stay up." I'm like, where's the motivation here? Like, no wonder you got relegated. If you're rolling out first game going, it's going to be difficult for us to stay up, then obviously the players are going to be like, oh. Now, obviously, there's a thing about self-motivation and stuff. Gio's big into that. He always brings it up, constantly going on about how players should be self-motivated, and they should. That's a very true thing to say. But at the same time, if your manager doesn't give a crap, do you? Not that he didn't give a crap, but that it's just a bit insane to come out and say. Whereas Nolan doesn't have that. He has that determination, that grit. He has it as a player, and I suspect he has it as a manager. Every time, pardon me, every time I've seen him talk about it, he seems to have it as a manager as well. He has that, I guess to quote Ric Flair, to be the man, you got to beat the man, and he has that. He will fight for everything. He will scrap for everything. I remember him getting sent off for Bolton once for arguing with the referee over a penalty Bolton gave away, which I seem to remember, and this was a long time ago, so I could be wrong, was a blatant penalty. But I seem to remember him going on the referee so much. It was probably Mike Dean. I think it was Mike Dean. I remember it on match day very clearly. Him getting sent off for it. That's how much he cared. That's how much he would fight for things. And Moyes needs that. Moyes needs someone in the dressing room to be able to do that. Because that's why Allardyce kept bringing him back. Obviously, Nolan was a very, very good football player. I'm not going to belittle that. He really, really was good. Much better than I think he got credit for. But Allardyce kept bringing him back because he trusted him to lead that dressing room. He was his voice in the dressing room because he had that passion, because he could pick players up and drive them. There's a reason why he was basically glued to Andy Carroll and gone sort this out. Because Andy Carroll was one of the key assets for both us and Newcastle. And if he went off the rails, it would be a problem. Whereas if you glue your most trusted person to him and go, we need this guy to perform, we need this guy to be as good as possible, then the results speak for themselves, right? That was why he kept doing it. That was why he kept being brought back. He was a force of nature as a footballer. But what is he like as a manager? Because ultimately, I think that might be where this is going. If Moyes, the idea of Moyes staying if we stay up is probably accurate, especially if we end up finishing sort of floating around lower mid-table, then he would definitely stay. I don't think our owners have the guts to fire him again. I don't think they have the guts for many things, but I certainly don't think they have the guts for that. But if he gets relegated, I think Moyes goes, and I think Kevin's probably in the place to take over. I mean, if I'm Kevin Nolan and West Ham came to me and offered a coaching position, I would be lying if I said that wouldn't be in the back of my mind. I wouldn't be sitting there thinking, like, obviously it's a great place to come and learn. Like David Moyes, there are worse people to learn how to be a coach under. As much as I disagree with David Moyes on many things, it's not. You're going to learn a lot working underneath him. He's a super experienced coach and done a lot of things. But I would be lying if in the back of my head there wasn't a thing that said, well, if David Moyes does end up getting got in the season, then I'm first in line. Because he does have managerial experience. I don't know what his tactics are. In my head, I would imagine they be Allardyce-esque, and that's not something I'm super keen on returning to. But I've never watched a Kevin Nolan side play, so I can't comment on that. But he has a decent managerial career. His points, I had a look, I've written them down here. His points per game are better than Moyes at West Ham, at Sunderland, at Sociedad, and they're basically the same as he had at Everton. Obviously, this is a much lower level. Notts County were in League Two, but that's a totally different thing. When he took over at Notts County, they were in the relegation zone. They'd just been on a 10, I think they're on a 10-match losing streak. I looked it up hours ago. This sort of, so if I'm getting it wrong, I apologise. It's basically what I'm saying there. A 10-match losing streak. They were in the relegation zone, and then he dragged them out of that first season up to 15th. I think they finished then, and then the second season, his full season with them, his only full season in management, they finished 5th. They got to the playoffs, which is an insane turnaround. Next season, he got chopped. I think after 6 games, he'd lost all of them, or lost 5 and drawn 1, or something like that. You could make the argument that's a bit early to get rid of him. But what happens? They went and got relegated. Like, no one came in and saved him. That was just what they were. So for him to come in when they're in the relegation zone, take them to 15th and then to 5th, and then the second he leaves for them to go back down again. I mean, it shows that influence he had. It shows that influence he had as a player, but also potentially as a manager. And if you're talking about Allardyce's influence on him, playing-wise, yeah, potentially that could be a thing. Like, it might be that he plays a similar style to Allardyce, which I'm not super keen on. But it's also interesting thing to note that Allardyce was always the guy who was quoted as sort of being ahead of his time. He had the sports science stuff. He had the he had a big staff. He, like, it's one thing I've read about him is that he had a huge staff, and that was partly why he was so successful, because he would get people who knew what they were doing better than he, and they trusted them to go and do what he was doing. And isn't that kind of what we want at the club right now? Don't we want someone to come in and build a setup that can be successful despite itself, almost like get those people in who know what they're doing and trusting them in the right positions to do good, not to put the trust in one man or one scout or one small director of football. Very short, man. Is that not what we want? I mean, those are also influences we have to take into account, because the obvious one is playing style, and again, I don't want to return to Allardyce playing style. I mean, we're under Moyes now, which is basically that, but less effective. But if he is half the man Allardyce was in that sense, if he could bring in a lot of people who knew what they were doing to support him, to make him and the team better, and yet he was there to drive them, to influence them, to make them work as hard as possible, then realistically, he might not be the worst option.